Hello and welcome back to At the Symposium. This video is going to be especially for the Shade Tree intellectual who requested that I talk about a certain subject having to do with breaking down arguments and logic. My previous video touched on this a little bit, and I did iterate in that video that I'd make a follow-up video, and I'd probably make another one after this. Part of the reason why it's taken so long to get to this is that it's a large subject, and I've been wondering how to actually approach it and try to approach it in a unique way. So in my last video, I talked about what I call the fallacy of historicism, and that was a fallacy that I found some historians often make when they're thinking about historic events, or they're thinking about things that happen. They tend to think about them in a linear fashion, right? That because A happened, then B happened, and so forth. So that's the first video I made talking about logical fallacies. Now, to just keep this in mind, that there are some not official fallacies, but there are some other historic fallacies that are also mentioned about historicism that doesn't relate to the one that I just mentioned. So the one that I just mentioned really has to do, it's almost like a sequentialism kind of deal. I associate it with historians, with history, because I see it as a tendency in that historic thinkers tend to make. They tend to see things in sequence when not everything follows a certain sequence, or not everything is relative to a certain sequence, or can be predicted by a chain of events necessarily, right? So that can be looked at as an historic fallacy, or we can see it as a sequential fallacy. Again, in the last video, I talked about the 10 or 15 logical fallacies, and I won't talk about that in this video because they're fairly commonly known. At least 3 to 5 of them, I say, were fairly commonly known. So it's pretty easy to look them up, and I think people have a good kind of grasp and understanding of those. What I really want to talk about here today is something that I found would be really helpful in breaking down argumentation that doesn't actually have to do too much with philosophy, any analytical philosophy, any kind of formulas or anything like that. Nothing like in the formal logic kind of domain. Anything like that, but an actually really effective way to understand philosophies, understand ideas, and understand even people. And I actually have a video, an essay recording. Really, it's a video, but it's like an essay video that I have recorded. It's entitled "Ideologies and Emotional Hierarchies." Okay, so that's kind of what I want to talk about here. So ideologies and emotional hierarchies. Now, the idea of this, and this again relates to how we find arguments. I'm going to say, how do you find arguments? Well, I think the best way to find an argument is to find the root value of where the argument is being placed. Okay, and this is why I call this ideologies and emotional hierarchies. The idea there, when speaking of an emotional hierarchy, what I'm trying to get across in this essay is that there are emotional hierarchies. There's an emotional structure, there's an emotional precedence that individuals have, and also philosophers have. And when I say philosophers, I'd be saying anybody that's maybe academic, anybody, or philosophies, right? I mean, not philosophers, but philosophies, right? If it's an economic philosophy, if it's just a regular philosophy, if it's a life philosophy, if it's a political philosophy, there's somewhere in there some kind of value, value that's related to some kind of emotion. Because emotions and values are going to come together in some way, because again, these things always relate to human beings. And if we have values, our values are going to relate to a certain behavior, right? And those behaviors are going to be carried about by certain emotions. I don't mean emotions by being emotional. I just mean emotions. Emotions will dictate your behavior, and your values will dictate your behavior, and you'll express that through certain emotions. So again, in this essay, what I talk about is the emotional hierarchies relative to certain ideologies. Now, I in part being a philosophy major, I also studied theology. So I'll throw in examples of that here and there. In this essay, that was primarily what I was doing. I actually threw in some Stoic philosophy in there to make the example. Well, the example that I used in there was to take something like the world religions. You can say the most common world religions, and we can even throw in Stoicism in there. And if you analyze those philosophies, let's say if we just analyze those as modes of ideology, right? Because that's kind of what religion specifically tends to be actually a domain in which we have emotional hierarchies, right? Because it's saying don't be this way, but be this way. Like, put this aside. You're going to have this tendency, but do this instead, right? That's kind of the basis of most of the major religions. Have that kind of basis. Now, whether their deity is different, whether their eschatology is different, what they think about the afterlife, what they think about how you should praise the one that's chosen to be, the one that you should worship, and whoever the chosen deity is or whatnot. What they all have in common is that there's an emotional hierarchy of which they want to instill in you that typically relates to a way in which you can have a better afterlife, or actually in also a better way that you can live this life relative to what might happen in the afterlife, depending on what they believe about that. But there's always an emotional hierarchy. Now, again, in this essay, I talked about Buddhism, Christianity, and Stoicism. I picked those three because they all have very similar emotional hierarchies. In Buddhism, just as in Christianity, just in Stoicism, we're supposed to be a kind of selfless individual. In Stoicism, you want to be very content, right? So there's just an idea about self-mastery, right? Which is very much a Buddhist concept. It's a Stoic concept. And it's also a Christian concept, right? To self-mastery, to be able to control those negative parts of your emotions and accentuate the positive, right? Now, how does this relate to argumentation? Well, if we're looking at an argument, whether we're talking to a person or whether we're looking at a philosophical idea or an economic idea, a political idea, all we have to do is really look at, within their line of reason, what emotional values are placed on their hierarchy. One classic example I like to use of this, which, forgive me because I feel like it's an easy example, but I think it's a nice one. So I just leave it at that. And it's really like the divide between like liberal economic thought and conservative economic thought. What tends to be the emotional hierarchy that's prized in liberal economic theory? More or less, it's usually the emotional kind of idea or value of fairness. Okay. So if we want to look at it, you could spend a lot of time, and this is why I didn't want to do this, because I want to look at it more in a broad sense and not just like in an academic sense and mention names and authors and this and that and the technicalities. So we can get into that, and if anybody wants to, that's all well and good. But in a broader sense, I think you can tell between the two camps of ideas that there's, again, an emotional hierarchy at play where they have certain values, and those are the values that they stick to. Or those are the values that they're temperamentally preordained to put on the top of their hierarchy and really to displace others, right? That's something, whether you like it or not. I know there's a lot of controversy about the individual. This is something that Jordan Peterson, the psychologist, kind of what's become now almost mainstream, very pop psychologist. Jordan Peterson's now, he talks about that a lot. Right, kind of the personality traits that get people to orientate people to certain political views, right? And if you're higher in openness or you're higher in creativity, that you'll go this way or go that way. If you're more orderly, you'll go this way, etc. Right? And I mean, by observation, I've seen that to be true. Again, we can't go. A lot of times we think about political ideas or philosophical ideas from the bottom up, but sometimes they happen the top. I think more than often they happen top down in a lot of cases where there's something about the personality that drives one to be interested in philosophies because they relate to their emotional palette, let's say. So again, the biggest divide: liberal theory, liberal economic theory, conservative economic theory. What is it? For liberals, it tends to be fairness. It tends to be fairness. But again, if we look at the personality trait, the personality trait for fairness would be something like compassion, right? So we got to go to the compassionate route. Somewhere involved in the liberal theory will probably be some kind of idea of fairness that's linked to an idea of compassion. Now, how about the conservative theory? What's that going to be? Well, it's usually some kind of theory about diligence, some kind of the pick you up by your bootstraps kind of mentality. So kind of like the hard work, diligence. It's not that they don't believe in fairness either, but it's I'm having a hard time thinking of a word for it. But as they believe in fairness also, but I think their route to fairness would be different, right? I think that oftentimes what the conservative thinkers have an issue with is, let's not assume that something that sounds fair is going to actually play out to be fair in the market, and there's a lot of real world data that speaks to that. This is something that I've talked about him in many videos. That's the economists like Thomas Sowell talks about a lot. People like Walter Williams, Shelby Steele. He's not an economist, but he's a writer that talks a lot in that vein. Heather McDonald, she's another one. Glenn Lowry is another one. John McWhorter is another one. There's a slew of people that kind of make a lot of content in that vein of, well, maybe something sounds fair, but it might not actually play out to be fair when those ideas are put out into the world. But in either case, there's a difference in values. There's a difference in values and in emotional hierarchies. The conservative emotional hierarchy, it's, well, let's use, I would say, be more strong-willed, right? There's emotional hierarchy there to be more strong-willed, which in a lot of ways, of course, makes sense because that's kind of how you want human beings to be, right? I mean, think about the way people raise their children. They don't raise their children necessarily to always be like children, right? They want them to grow and to make up their own will. One could argue that one of the largest jobs and responsibilities that a parent takes on is to instill individual will into their child, right? And that's very much a strong. That's very much high on the emotional hierarchy for conservative thinkers. Is let's be strong-willed and persistent, right? Let's be strong-willed and pursue our own happiness, and let's put that at the top of the emotional hierarchy. And liberal economic thinkers say, well, let's put fairness at the top of the emotional hierarchy. Conservatives say, no, well, that downplays what should be at the top of the emotional hierarchy, right? Because again, it's not that they don't believe in the same things. Like, again, in philosophy, in theory, and in life, I think oftentimes you find that it's not that people mostly have the same basic values. It's how they order them is the difference. This is why I'm talking about hierarchies, because it's not, we might all have the same 10 values, but we order them in different places. So we want to break down an argument. It's imperative to go look at what order in which you see that they're privileging certain ideas. Okay. Now the conservative economic thinker would say, I think you're privileging the idea of fairness over your idea of practicality and individual will, and the liberal thinker is going to say, well, I think you're overemphasizing, the facility of willpower and volition, and don't see, the social responsibility to propagate fairness in the world. It's not that the conservative thinker doesn't believe in fairness, and it's not so much that the liberal thinker doesn't believe in being strong-willed. As they order these in different places on their emotional hierarchy or their value scale, and that's a very easy way to break down theories and arguments and where people are coming from, like I said, in and outside of the academy, in and outside philosophy, in and outside academic work. If you're interested in listening to the essay, it's a short essay. It's on my video list. It's on my video list, so check it out there. It's a quick essay. But yeah, ideologies and emotional hierarchies, great way to break down arguments. I will be back soon to probably make a brief video. I'm going to try and think of something interesting to do for the 10 to 15 the logical fallacies. I might just go over them real brief, but I want to go over, see if we can find something interesting in there, because like I said, they're fairly well known. They're easy enough to look up. But that's my bit on that. I hope you appreciate it. If you like the video, please like, subscribe, and I'll see you soon.